I'd now like to introduce to you David Jackson. David Jackson considers that he was one of the lucky ones because he was spared institutions and multi-placement moves and had a saint of a foster mum. And actually, when you read David's story about his foster mum, God, I wish I'd met her. She was brilliant, wasn't she? How blessed for you, mate. His mum respected everyone, not only the children she cared for, but also their parents. She considered it important to include and acknowledge birth families and relationships. This has influenced David's approach in social work practice and child protection, where he's worked for 16 years, and where sadly he has experienced abuse by a system which still struggles to be family and community friendly and inclusive. I think it takes a lot of guts, David, just to say that. As the state representative of the Alliance of Forgotten Australians, David gets the opportunity at the national level to make recommendations and influence change, a role to which he was referred by the Mulligan inquiry when he reported his abuse as an employee. I'd like to welcome David Jackson.
Everybody for having me, and particular thanks to Dee and to Priscilla and to Tony for getting this book to actually happen, and of course to my partner Peter who supported me through this process. So yeah, my thanks. I didn't prepare anything for today because I'm going to read something briefly from the book, but I did want to reflect on three things. I remembered three numbers, so three things. One, when I started social work 16 years ago, I was really fortunate to have read a book which Jayden actually made a contribution to, which is called Every Childhood Lasts a Lifetime. And I would really encourage everybody that has any interest in this area, if they haven't read that book, to do so. My understanding of the book was that the prevailing theme was it was when somebody in the system, institutions, out-of-home care, whatever it was when somebody gave something personally of themselves and showed some empathy, compassion, and that they cared, that they were planting a seed that then resulted in beautiful bloom and growth for that individual at some stage, not always immediately, but at some stage in their life. So yeah, I'd like to thank you, Jayden, for having made your contribution to that little bit of inspiration for me many years ago. So that's one thing. The second thing that I wanted to say is I really want to say thank you to all of the people that made a contribution to this book that for whatever reason aren't actually standing up here today. I'm really humbled to actually be able to use my voice, and in using my voice I want to reflect on your contribution and my gratitude to your contribution, because we're part of a collective. It's when we stand together that I think that we have solidarity, we have community, we can fight for inclusion, which is really important. So the people that have made contributions to this book, the people that have lived these rich, amazing lives that are out there in the community, some in this room, they're the people that I feel most strongly and humbled for. The third thing I wanted to say is, it's no surprise, but the inspiration for me in my stories, of course, were women. Strong, beautiful, fantastic women. Firstly, my mum, who you've heard referred to as a saint, my foster mum. She is really the focus on my first inclusion. My second inclusion was on a wonderful woman called Violet Duffield, which many of you I think would know and recognise from the Rundle Mall, a Salvation Army lady that used to knit the crow's-coloured scarves and bang the tambourine and whack people over the head with her walking stick. And it was through visiting Violet in a nursing home at the last stage of her life that I was befriended by this amazing woman called Daphne Florence, who just became the most joyous and supportive friend to me, and a partner in crime of sorts, and one that I'll take to my grave with absolute gratitude for that friendship. So bravo for women, of course. So having said that, I'll actually find, I didn't know what the etiquette was, I didn't know whether it was appropriate for me to have a bolder print to read from or to read from a book, so just bear with me and I'll find my contribution. And
you use the index if you wanted to.
yeah. So this is an excerpt from my first inclusion called I Was Just Trying to Matter, and this is really with gratitude and love to my mum. So I'm partway through that story, I'll take it up. The thing that would strike me as most progressive about my mum, who was otherwise a simple and modest living countrywoman, was her absolutely non-judgmental attitude towards the families of the children she cared for. My mum was a big believer in, an absolute devotee towards not having a bad word to say about anyone, a true Virgoan trait. I believe she had a very rich and deep inner poise, and in an absolutely egalitarian and thus non-snobbish way, I believe the private affairs of others and the associated wagging of tongues was of absolutely no interest to her whatsoever. For her soulful and spiritual yearnings, she would turn to her daily reading of the Bible and the Seventh-day Adventist record, which would always be the last thing she would do at night before she turned out the bedlight. It was nothing for my mum to have open doors to any parent or family member of any of the children whom she had in her care. Many turned up, each with their own experiences of adversity and despair, some of which were so tormenting that it would fracture a personality and leave it broken beyond repair. But my mum would pass no judgment and would never stand in the way of a family or a parent's needs and rights to see their children. And yes, whilst there were some difficulties incurred through such an open and liberal attitude, in the very long run, I think it made for the best outcomes. Parents and children were connected and knew each other, and children knew all along of their origins. Very often, these connections were forged so that relationships that were to last through life had begun through these acts of wisdom and what today would be seen as measured risk. I couldn't have been more proud of my mum than I was at the funeral of my birth uncle, who had been killed suddenly in a head-on collision. Stephen was a notorious underworld figure, but he was also a welcome feature of my childhood, with his Cat Stevens looks and style, Jimi Hendrix hair, cerulean blue eyes, English rose girlfriend, the orthodox gold cross around his neck, and invariably stolen MG sports car in which he would come visiting from Melbourne in. My mum had loved him dearly, as she had a special love for all the rascals. When she heard of Stephen's death, she was extremely saddened, but she was also pleased to finally have a chance to see him again and to say her goodbyes. The funeral was held in a chapel with squeaky wooden floors, and there was a great divide between those who attended. Some were his friends from the underworld, some were connected to his Serbian Orthodox birth origins, and then there was his great uncle, the only family member who belonged to the Baha'i faith. As everyone entered the chapel, they were rendered still in their sudden realisation of an open casket which sat in the middle of the room. But not my mum, who easily broke ranks. Her face beamed with joy as she got the opportunity to embrace her beloved Stephen again one last time, regardless of religion or race or the scars he now carried as a result of such an horrific accident. So what did all this mean to me in the greater scheme of a life beyond childhood and adolescence? A life which invariably will be lived in adulthood and not in care. I knew straight up from my earliest memories of my diverse circumstances. Nothing was shielded from me. I also knew that I was incredibly lucky to have been chosen by my mum to join her family and receive her abundant love, open-minded and open-heartedness in not judging my family of origin. I'd experienced firsthand from many other sources, particularly school and welfare, the good intention but stinging wrath of the judgment and disapproval of my birth mum. I always felt when people made negative comments about her that somehow they applied to me too, because after all, I was her child and of her flesh. Also, she was my mum, even though I was lucky and had another mum, one which society would and did approve of, but my birth mum was my mum too. Thank you.
Everybody who's written contributions to this book are different. I do love, though, in David's, is that he's a fabulous storyteller, you know, and he writes beautifully. Thanks very much, Dan.